Welcome to Philippine Stories Deep Dive channel. Today we're going to deep dive into a story that's making some waves in the Philippines. Basically, it all started with this post on the Chinese social media platform Red Note, and it claimed that Palawan, that beautiful island, popular tourist spot, part of the Philippines, well, they claim it actually belongs to China and should be returned. So to help us break this all down, we have an expert who can really shed some light on all of this, the history and how valid this claim actually is. So welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
So, okay, let's get right into this post. It specifically says that Palawan, it was originally called, get this, Zheng Island, named after a famous Chinese explorer from way back, like the 14th century. And yeah, I know Zheng He, this legendary admiral, sailed massive fleets all over the place, but was he really here in the Philippines?
Well, you're right. He was a remarkable figure in maritime history, that's for sure. And his voyages were extensive, there's no doubt about that, but they were primarily focused on the western seas. Think the Indian Ocean, the Arabian Peninsula, even parts of Africa.
What now?
There's really no historical evidence to suggest that he ever explored the waters near the Philippines, let alone claiming territory there.
So this whole idea that Palawan was named after him and therefore belonged to China seems a little bit, well, let's just say the Philippine Navy wasn't buying it.
Right.
They called it, and I quote, baseless and totally absurd.
Yeah.
And they even went so far as to suggest that because China regulates social media so tightly, these kinds of posts, they could be part of like a deliberate strategy to kind of control the narrative.
Hmm. That's a really interesting point. It really raises the question, is this just some random person spouting off online, or could this be something more calculated, like something aiming to sway public opinion and maybe even lay the groundwork for future claims?
Yeah, it's definitely something to think about. And it's not just the Navy pushing back. The National Historical Commission of the Philippines, they're like the official keepers of the country's history. And they've made it very clear that the Philippines has always had control, sovereignty over Palawan. They say no other country has ever contested that fact.
And this is where we run into the bigger problem of the South China Sea. See, China claims sovereignty over practically the entire South China Sea, even the West Philippine Sea, which is within the Philippines' exclusive economic zone.
Right.
And this claim is based on their 9-dash line, which they just recently expanded to a 10-dash line to include areas near Taiwan. It's a pretty bold move, basically redrawing maritime boundaries however they want.
Wait, hold on. 10 dashes. It's like they're just adding dashes whenever they feel like it.
Yeah.
Didn't an international tribunal already say this whole 9-dash line thing was bogus?
You're absolutely right. Back in 2016, an international tribunal ruled that China's 9-dash line claim had no legal basis. But the thing is, China just rejected the ruling, and they're sticking to their claims in the region. This whole 10-dash line thing just shows how determined they are to control the narrative no matter what international law says.
So we've got this social media post saying Palawan belongs to China based on some shaky history. Then we have the Philippine Navy saying it's ridiculous and maybe part of a bigger strategy. And on top of all that, we have this tension and disputed territory in the South China Sea. Seems like this post, whether they meant to or not, has stirred up a hornet's nest and brought all these complicated issues to the surface. What do you make of the Philippines' response, though? It seems like they're relying on strong words and historical claims, but wouldn't it be more effective to present some hard historical evidence as a counter-strategy?
That's a good question. You're right. The Philippines' response has been mostly about denying the historical claims and calling out the post's intentions. Maybe they think getting into a big historical debate would just give the post's claims legitimacy and play into China's hands, or, maybe they're worried about making things worse. It's a tricky situation for sure.
Yeah, for sure. And it really makes you wonder, is this post just a silly online thing? Or is it a sign of something bigger, something that needs a more strategic response from the Philippines?
It's definitely something to think about. This incident might just be the tip of the iceberg, It could show a bigger shift in how China is going about making its claims in the region. The Philippines, actually, the whole world is watching to see what happens next. It's crazy how this thing shows how blurry the lines are getting, between stuff people say online and actual real-world geopolitics.
It's like this whole new battleground, right? Like instead of warships and jets, we're fighting with hashtags and viral posts.
Yeah.
But, some people would say, come on, it's just one post. What kind of damage can that really do? How much weight do you think that argument really carries?
Not a whole lot, to be honest with you. It's easy to brush off social media as just, frivolous, but the reality is that platforms like this Red Note thing, they have a huge reach, and they can be incredibly effective tools for shaping how the public thinks. especially when they're being used strategically. You know what I mean?
Right, because even if this specific post is just some person's opinion, it still feeds into this bigger narrative that China's been pushing for years.
Yeah, exactly. And that's where it gets dangerous. Even stuff that seems isolated, like this post, it can add to this bigger shift in how people see things, especially if it goes viral and tons of people see it. It's like planting a seed. You might not see anything right away, but give it time, it could grow into something much bigger.
So how do we deal with this new world of information where a single post can have real-world consequences? This whole thing really makes me think about how easily we fall for these catchy narratives, even if they're not completely true. It's like we need to become amateur historians and geopolitical analysts just to keep up.
Well, I don't think everyone needs a PhD or anything, but it's super important to be skeptical of information, especially with sensitive stuff like these territorial disputes or historical claims.
Okay, so what's the cure? How do we protect ourselves from getting manipulated by all this online stuff, especially when it's disguised as these harmless-looking posts about history?
Well, one of the most important things is to get your information from a bunch of different places. Don't just rely on one social media site or one news outlet. Look for different perspectives, even ones that might challenge what you already think.
I get that. It's so easy to just get stuck in your own little bubble online.
Mhm.
But even if you're trying to be objective, how do you filter out all the junk and figure out what's actually real?
That's where critical thinking comes in. You can't just passively take in information, especially not online. You got to ask yourself, who's putting this out there? What do they want? And what's the big picture, the context?
So it's like being a detective, always looking for clues and questioning the evidence.
Exactly. And don't be scared to dig a little deeper, okay?
Yeah.
Look for sources that actually back up their arguments with evidence, not just emotional appeals or catchy slogans.
It's all starting to feel a bit overwhelming, to be honest. Are we saying that everyone needs to be an expert on stuff like international law and history just to scroll through their social media feeds?
No, 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 not at all. It's more about just being aware of how information works and developing the skills to think about it carefully. You don't have to be an expert. You just have to be someone who is engaged, thinking about the information they're consuming.
And this isn't just about Palawan or the South China Sea, right? This is happening everywhere. People use social media to shape the narrative about everything from elections to climate change.
Absolutely. This whole incident is just a small example of something much bigger that's happening all over the world. And it shows how important it is to understand media and be able to think critically, now more than ever.
So we've talked about this Red Note post and how it all connects to what China's doing in the South China Sea. But let's think about the Philippines for a minute. They're stuck in the middle of this geopolitical tug of war, with China making these big claims practically on their doorstep. What does this mean for the average person in the Philippines?
Well, just imagine living in a place like Palawan, beautiful island, pristine beaches, vibrant culture, and then boom, you see this post online saying your home really belongs to another country. It's got to create some uncertainty, some anxiety.
Yeah, but it's pretty unsettling. Like it's like the rug's being pulled out from under you.
Exactly. And it goes beyond just the emotional impact. When there's a dispute over your country's territory, it raises all these questions about security, economic stability, even national identity.
And I imagine it stirs up nationalistic feelings on both sides, making it even harder to find some kind of middle ground.
Absolutely. And that's why it's so important to focus on things like dialogue, understanding, and respect for international law. Social media could even play a role in that. Instead of spreading misinformation and causing more tension, it could be used to have more productive conversations and look for peaceful solutions.
You're right. It's easy to get caught up in all the negativity and fear-mongering, but social media can also be a powerful tool for connecting people and building bridges. But how do we get there? How do we change the conversation from one of hostility to one of cooperation?
Well, for one thing, we need to promote media literacy and critical thinking skills, like we talked about earlier. But we also need to encourage people to be more empathetic and understanding of other cultures. If people can see each other as human beings with shared hopes and dreams, not just political enemies, it becomes so much easier to find common ground.
It's like that old saying, walk a mile in someone else's shoes.
Precisely. And that's where social media can actually be helpful. It gives us the opportunity to connect with people from all over the world and understand their perspectives and experiences. It can help break down stereotypes and build bridges instead of walls.
Well, I think we've covered a lot of ground today. From a simple social media post all the way to the complexities of geopolitics and how online narratives can be so powerful.
It's been a great discussion, and I hope it encourages our listeners to think more critically and be more engaged with the information they come across, both online and offline.
As we wrap up this deep dive, I have one final thought-provoking question for all of you to consider. Can social media, with all its downsides and potential for misuse, actually be a force for good in the world? Can it help us bridge divides, promote understanding, and find peaceful solutions to these big global challenges? It's definitely something to think about.
It is. And in the end, the answer is up to us.
Well said. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the Philippines and the South China Sea. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep learning.